Okay, I think we should start now and people can catch up as they join us. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series. This one's entitled In Conversation, the Need for the Human Behaviour-Change Project. And this takes up from where we left off last time. On the panel is myself, Professor Jana Hastings and Professor Mary Johnston. And joining us in conversation, which will be a pre-recorded video, is Dr. Jamie Hartman-Boyce, who's an associate professor at the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford. And she uses and is very interested in ontologies in relation to evidence synthesis. And then we have Professor Bruce Chorpita, who is from he's a professor of psychology at the University of California, Los Angeles. And he's really interested in using ontologies to help the translation of evidence into practice, and particularly in his area in relation to mental health services. So we'll have 25 minutes, which will be in conversation, Jana with Bruce and myself with Jamie, and then we'll have 25 minutes discussion. As ever, please post any questions you have in the Q&A box, and just feel free to do that as the videos are playing. And then upvote any questions you want answered, because we'll answer those questions first from the most upvoted ones. And we will attempt to answer as many of your questions as we can during the discussion, but we'll keep a record of all the questions that have been asked, and those will be shared on the Open Science Framework. We're recording every webinar in the series, so they'll be uploaded onto YouTube, and we'll also make the slides available on the Open Science Framework. And finally, we'll email you the links to the recording and the webinar slides, so you'll have all the information following this webinar. Okay, so without further ado, in conversation, why the Human Behaviour Change Project Part 2.
I am really delighted to have here with me today Professor Bruce Chorpita, who is Professor of Psychology at UCLA. Bruce, thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I'm in the Department of Psychology at UCLA. That's my primary appointment. And my colleagues and I, we've spent a long time, about 25 years, I guess, building and testing novel appliances to improve outcomes in children's mental health. So we focus on things like intervention design, clinical decision-making ecology, information delivery models, service system architecture, so how mental health service systems are organized, business procedures and processes.
That's a really, really important remit. And so we're here to talk about the Human Behaviour Change Project. You've heard of the Human Behaviour Change?
Oh yes, I'm very familiar. And Susan, I'm a huge fan of Susan's work and your work and the entire team. Very exciting. And I guess what I want to say about it is that, you know, I've been thinking about it since you reached out over email. More specifically, what would I want to say to lots of people? And I guess there's one thing I want to emphasize is that this kind of infrastructure, and I'll say it again many times in this webinar, it is a critical piece of infrastructure, essential if we are to live in a world where our actions are guided by science. This kind of undertaking is essential, and I think the Human Behavior Change Project in particular is an exemplary version of this kind of endeavor that needs to be done. So it's one of the most disciplined efforts I've ever encountered. And I say this as somebody who for 20 years has been saying, I would like to see ontologies introduced into behavior change and into mental health. And I feel like, you know, I have felt ignored for at least the first 10 years. So when this came along, I'm so delighted. And it's just something I will continue to point to as this is the way the field needs to go. So I'm thrilled, and I'm thrilled that you asked me to comment on all this too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know that feeling of feeling like not being listened to in this broader sort of scope and topic. It's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
So could you say something about what you think the challenges are for sort of comprehensively interpreting our existing evidence base about interventions?
Sure. So we only have 6 hours together here, right? So I can only, so there's no way I can tell you what all the challenges are in a short interview. There are too many to list, but I would say, and a little asterisk here, I don't think comprehensiveness is a realistic. So I know you said comprehensively interpreting the evidence base.
Right.
Just if we were to have a discussion about what is the evidence base, we could run out an hour trying to figure out where those boundaries are. And I would say, along the lines of Herb Simon, I don't think we need to optimize and use every single bit of the evidence base to make every decision, but rather to satisfy and say, at what point do we have enough to proceed efficiently with a relative degree of a tolerable amount of uncertainty, so that we can move forward influenced by what science tells us. So I'm sort of feeling like, can we use more of the evidence base? Right now, we digest the evidence base through a tiny coffee straw and get a teeny tiny little bit of it in the best case scenarios.
Right.
You know, in the US, the best mental health systems that are implementing many evidence-based treatments are ignoring 97%, 98% of the, even the randomized trial evidence based on children's mental health by selecting just a few little instances.
Right.
So anyway, that's my comprehensiveness part of it. But look, if I were to say what's the biggest challenge, it's probably the biggest challenge humans are facing in all endeavors at this point, which is the wealth of information we have at this point in time and the accompanying misinformation makes the task of exploiting and extracting knowledge from the world in order to make decisions about what to do next, whether it's driving, shopping, or providing mental health care, has become a burden on humans that we've never experienced in history. So we, sometimes when I say this to families, they're surprised, but we know more about how to reduce human suffering than humans have known for 20,000 years. And tomorrow we will know more than we know today.
Yeah.
And next week we will know even more. And managing that wealth of information is something we have not yet prepared to take on.
Yeah.
And that is the single biggest challenge I think facing in mental health, but I think almost in any aspect of human life at this point.
Do you think there's additional challenges, not just in finding out sort of what we know and what that suggests that we should do, but then in translating the sort of evidence that we have into practice? Are there additional challenges there?
There are, yeah. So if I were to describe what I see as the pathway from discovery to, right, so, we found out something new about what works, all the way to the point of someone acting on that discovery, there are many, many steps along that path. And if we think of that as a knowledge architecture, I have to say, and apologies to anyone who, this is not meant as an offense, but the knowledge architecture we have now is inadequate, and it is characterized by highly abundant, insular, relatively indistinguishable resources built around contrived use cases with strict rules for implementation.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that we are having a hard time getting them to diffuse and become part of everyday care. Now, it's a giant leap forward from where we were in the 1980s, where care was maybe driven by intuition or other things, but it's proven itself insufficient for solving this problem of providing adequate care on a large scale. I want to be clear, I think treatment manuals and the people who made them are fantastic. They're great instruments of discovery,
Yeah.
They teach us many things from clinical trials. They can be applied and implemented in some contexts successfully. I'm critiquing the architecture, the sheer number of manuals. In children's mental health, there are 815, 830. Anybody who understands how GPS works knows there's a lot of information moving around behind the scenes that has to be managed by machines. And if we're to do that in mental health, we're going to have to speak the language of machines. We're going to have to formalize what we're talking about, the concepts. And that is where ontologies play an incredibly large role.
Your vision of what's needed for the future involves kind of ontologies as one element of a self-diffusing knowledge architecture. Is that a fair summary of what?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, at the end point of the architecture should be resources and applications that nearly diffuse themselves. Now, I mean, the way I think about ontologies, I say this a lot to people who work in implementation science. 90% of a bridge still puts you in the river, right? So you need every part of this chain to work to get from science to application in practice. And so again, to think about GPS, there are, you know, the ontological equivalent is this sort of mapping of the streets and storage, digital storage of representation of all the different choices of turns and things like that. But you have satellites, you have real-time positioning of where you are, you have software that is where you are to where you want to be at every given moment. You have a hardware device that has an interface that speaks the native language of the driver. And right, so there's all these other parts, including that last, like, what is the native ontology? My colleague Eric Daleiden refers to this as the final mile problem in knowledge architecture.
Yeah.
Even if you get a device that can tell a machine what to do, that human user at the end needs to be influenced in their native ontology. So the other complexity in this is like, which I don't know where to fold this in with all the questions. It's like, will there be an ontology or will there be many? And I'm in the camp of there will always be many. And one of the major challenges we face is the translating among them, including that final translation to the native ontology of the user to influence what they do next. But all of this has to work together. And I want to say, like, while you're asking questions, that like there's certain points I love to make, and one of them is this, because I love this. The reason I like GPS as an example, when people think of my work and how it's relevant to ontologies, they often think of common elements, and then the next step is that people think of simplicity. Oh, common elements are a way to simplify. And the reason I use GPS as an example is if you understand how GPS works, it's extremely not simple.
That's right.
And the back end to this knowledge architecture that we will need, that is ontologically enabled, is not simple. And so the rush for the field to go, I don't want people to say, oh, ontologies are going to be a simple thing that solves our problems. They will be an element of a very complex knowledge architecture that should feel simple to the end user.
Yeah.
Right? Like GPS. It just told me to turn left. It just told me to try putting my child to bed an hour earlier. You know, like that's how it should feel. But the field needs to be prepared to undertake getting into the weeds with that complexity and managing that, because I am convinced it is the only way to that next paradigm.
Yeah,
so I'll pause.
That's really important insight, I think, and it's a really good way to present what we try and do. It sort of needs to be simple at the point of delivery, but it cannot be simple under the hood, right? It won't work. It won't do all the things it has to do. That's a really interesting insight, I think. So thank you for that. So I just have one last question, which is really coming back to the Human Behaviour Change Project, which is this knowledge system being developed around an ontology and some annotated evidence. And I wondered if you had any thoughts, sort of how the HBCP in particular can contribute, and how other approaches which are similar can contribute to solving this problem, this general sort of need for this knowledge architecture.
Sure. And as I said to Susan, we are on the same team, and I'm so delighted to have people working in this area, and we need more. So I would say this, my general feeling is I'm just thrilled. I feel like I've waited my whole career for this kind of stuff to start happening, and feel like I'm not the only one thinking these thoughts, right? Like it's for me personally, it's validating to feel like, hey, people are seeing that this is what's needed to move forward. I think we need more people moving into this space. We absolutely need it. We need more people to understand it, come into the space, not to think it's something I don't understand or it doesn't make sense to me. Like we just need more people talking about how this is the only way we are going to actually live our values of clinical science and say everything we should do should be guided by evidence, right? Anyway, I can't be more excited about this, and yet I'm still cautious about, we need more people to get on this train. This is a historical moment in human history, and it's an exciting thing, and it's a little bit scary, but I think we can, the blueprint is there. I think we see the way forward. We just need to execute, and we need big scale institutional commitment, because it's going to take a lot of work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bruce. That was really amazing. And I really look forward to collaborating and working together on this big challenge.
Likewise. I'm really grateful for being invited and grateful for the work that you do. So thank you.
Jamie, thank you very much for joining us. Could we start off by you telling us who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. So my name is Jamie Hartman-Boyce. I'm an associate professor in evidence-based policy and practice at the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences, University of Oxford. So it's a mouthful, but there the bulk of my research work relates to systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. And I work really closely with the Cochrane Tobacco Addiction Review Group, in particular, reviewing evidence on interventions to combat tobacco addiction.
Great, thank you. Well, let's start with you saying what you think the main challenges are when you try to conduct systematic reviews of evidence of effectiveness of interventions, and what the challenges are of trying to synthesize that evidence to give an overall picture of what the evidence is saying.
So there are a couple big challenges. One of them is simply the amount of information we have. Publishing is changing. The number of papers that get published, the speed at which they're published is increasing in all fields. And I think COVID has shown us how evidence in an area can literally just kind of explode over a few months. And it means that actually conducting systematic reviews takes quite a bit of time. And often by the time we publish that systematic review, if it's a fast moving area, or if it's an area where the evidence is pretty uncertain, then we risk the systematic review being out of date by the time it's published. And that isn't a particularly helpful situation. However, we don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited manpower to be sifting through a huge amount of research. So that puts us in kind of a tricky position. I think the other big challenge is variation in the studies that we have in front of us, both thinking about the interventions, the populations, the context, the comparators, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we have to do as systematic reviewers is make the call, is it appropriate to combine results from these studies? Would we expect these studies to have the same results or not? And if we do decide to combine those studies and we find they don't have the same results, how do we unpick that? What do we know about why we're seeing those differences? And are there contexts in which the outcome that we've come up with is actually misleading?
Okay, and I suppose the variation is in methods, in measures, but also in the terms that people use, the language they use to describe different concepts.
Absolutely. There are so many different ways to say the same thing. Sometimes disciplines will differ, but at least be consistent within disciplines. Other times you just have people who understandably are writing an article, they want to wax lyrical, and they're just using different words to mean the same things. And it can result in a huge amount of confusion. And that is a waste of time, essentially, because you're spending a lot of time trying to sort through that. If you're searching for papers, you're putting in a lot of different search terms. but it's also really can be quite critical in terms of causing misunderstandings and the wrong interventions or the wrong studies being understood in the wrong way because of differences in the languages used.
Yes, and when we're looking at evidence, we're not just wanting to know what the effect was of an intervention, but also we want to know about how that intervention worked, what the processes of change was, because by knowing that, one can then understand what's going on and then develop more effective interventions. What are the challenges for assessing those processes of change?
That is incredibly challenging. So when I first started systematic reviewing, I had this kind of rose tinted glasses situation where I thought we're going to find these papers, they're all going to report all of these change measures in the same way, using the same terminology in great detail, and then we will be able to synthesize that information and make sense of it. I was quickly disabused of that notion. I think processes of change are rarely well reported in studies. They often use different terminology, scales, and outcomes, and they can also be very context dependent in terms of the types of things they're describing. If you don't have a huge literature base on which to draw, the chances that you're going to find enough meaningful information across studies to combine it is actually quite low. So it ends up being a situation where we kind of have this black box. They described this intervention, we have this final outcome, and we don't know what happened in the middle. We don't know if it's the same between studies, we don't know if it's different, and we don't know which parts of it are really critical. So one of the things we need is, of course, better reporting of studies using the same language, looking into the same processes, but we also need a mechanism to find those papers, because sometimes those papers are out there, but they're not in the main study report. Articles have word limits, which is great for the reader, but for us systematic reviewers is sometimes challenging if the information we need is kind of dispersed over 10 different publications. Tracking those down can be difficult and is certainly time consuming.
Yeah, yeah. And my experience of conducting systematic reviews and reading systematic reviews of evidence is so often the result is there was small to medium effect with large heterogeneity, i.e. there was real variation of effectiveness across study types, across populations, across settings. How do you deal with that? And what are the challenges of that? Because it seems to me that actually that heterogeneity itself is what we need to understand if we're to know what the impact or what the importance and the implications of different study findings are to other populations and settings.
Absolutely. And so in your observation is absolutely right, that most of the time we're in a situation where we might find a small to moderate effect size and then say, but there was unexplained heterogeneity is what we might say in our reviewer speak. Basically, there's differences between the studies in terms of their outcomes and we don't know why. And here, the tools for assessing heterogeneity and trying to figure this out, I'd say have been pretty crude for some time, though we are getting better at it. So originally we might do a subgroup analysis, which is just looking at one variable. Then we started using meta-regression. And now we're moving to new techniques. So component network meta-analysis, for example, is something I'm using at the moment. But the more complex those techniques get, essentially the more literature and the more well-reported literature we need to make sense of it, because we cannot investigate heterogeneity in a really small sample. If we don't have that many studies, it's really difficult to unpick what is driving the heterogeneity. So we need a way to access this literature, to code it up, making sure that the same constructs mean the same things across these papers, to really make sure that our analyses are powered enough to detect the reasons for those differences.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, what you've talked about is really one of the motivations for developing the Human Behaviour-Change Project. And as you know, it's a collaboration between behavioural scientists, computer scientists, and also systems architects. And I'd be really interested in your perspective about how you think this project could help with the kind of challenges you've been talking about.
Absolutely. Well, I think it can help in a number of ways. I suppose one of the first ones is if it enables us to speed up processes, then it means that either we can get those systematic reviews out quicker or we can include more literature and more detail in those systematic reviews. And I think automation of data extraction is a pretty critical place for that. That is, in my experience, something that takes up a lot of time. And any tools we have that can help us with that process, I think will make a big difference in terms of the future of evidence synthesis and in how useful it is. I think also things around developing an ontology, so developing common language that we can use, common constructs that we can pin our data extraction essentially onto, is extremely helpful in terms of subsequent analyses, and also just in terms of communicating the evidence we find, because it's not just about conducting these systematic reviews. We also want to make sure they're used and interpreted in the right way. And so ontologies, I think, are critical to kind of both of those processes. And the other thing I think is that the more information we have, as I was talking about with heterogeneity, it means we have more power to look at differences between studies, to predict outcomes, and also gives us more power to make inferences about places where we don't have enough information to a specific context, but we do have some information that we hope can inform that. And this is a really powerful tool in that way as well. This might mean making inferences about what an intervention might happen in terms of outcomes in a specific population or in a specific area. It could also mean predicting possible effective interventions that haven't been tested yet or have only been tested in a few studies. So I think there's so much literature out there, so much work has gone in to conducting these primary studies, and it's almost kind of a moral duty of us to make the most of the ability to bring those studies together and create something from it that's more than just the sum of its parts.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I think what you said about the prediction based on outcomes rather than on mean differences, which is often what happens in evidence synthesis, is again another motivator for the project, because actually when policymakers or planners or practitioners interrogate the evidence, they're often trying to answer particular questions, you know, about what works for this particular group of people in this particular group of setting and this particular type of behavior, and maybe they've got a particular mode of delivery in mind or a duration of outcome. So they've got, you know, they've got particular questions they want to ask, and what they want to know is, for this scenario, what's the outcome likely to be given what we know? And so I hope that it kind of matches more to what people are actually wanting to use evidence for.
Absolutely. I think for us, things like mean differences or risk ratios are very, very useful when we're combining results across studies and trying to measure the effect of an intervention. But when you're then applying that to real world, you do need some sense of what that means, right? A kind of twofold increase from 1 in 100 to 2 in 100 is very different from a twofold increase from 20 to 40 in 100, for example. And of course, policymakers want to know that, as well as the people using this evidence themselves, so patients, carers, etc.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, thank you very much. That's been really interesting. Great. Well, those are two very interesting discussions, and I think went very well together with Jamie talking about the challenges of synthesizing evidence across individual studies and how ontologies and the machine learning and AI that we're developing can help with that process. And then Bruce talking about the huge challenge of getting evidence into policy and practice, and his frustration over decades working with mental health services for children and adolescents is very tangible. But also what's wonderful is his excitement about these new technologies coming along, which he really does believe can move things forward considerably. So welcome all of those who maybe joined at some point since the beginning, and do put questions up or comments up if anybody has any. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. There are some. Excellent. Yes. Good. So firstly, Peter H is questioned is, how can we make sure as researchers we're not adding to the mess of evidence? Good question.
Good question.
Who would like to have a go at that first? I mean, I can start off.
I'll respond.
No.
So that one of the things that has impressed me about the work on ontologies is the extent to which things are connected. So that the mess of evidence is often driven by the silos that we work in. We work in particular disciplines, we work in particular domains of problems, and they remain separate, and therefore there's a mess. One of the main tasks in developing ontologies is to make them operate across disciplines and across all of the users, so that people can locate the terms they're using and connect across ontologies. I'm trying to explain interoperability between ontologies, the fact that you can actually recognize the same thing in different systems. So that one of the things that's impressed me is its extent to clarify the mess, or even to point out where there's a mess that needs to be clarified.
Yeah. And Janet?
Yeah, I would just add to this that the idea, I think that researchers should not try completely to avoid contributing to the mess, because in a way, doing all research at the moment, given the tools and infrastructures that are available, is necessarily going to contribute to the mess, right? Until the infrastructure and the whole ecosystem is transformed, you can't avoid adding somehow not yet pre-integrated content if you do research, right? So I think our current, but for the future, the focus should be on making somehow transformations to the ecosystem that serve researchers and yet reduce the mess. So it has to preserve this activity of research in all its full diversity while reducing the mess.
Yeah, and I think getting going on thinking about how to reduce the mess right at the beginning, right from having an idea, how do you formulate the research question? How do you translate that research question into methods that can really address it? How do you specify those methods right at the beginning in a way that in the end will be computer readable, in the end can be synthesized easily with other protocols of methods or reports of methods? And one way of doing this, and in fact we're going to be developing this much more in hopefully the second phase of this research, is to develop what has already been developed in this Human Behaviour Change Project, and there is a webinar later on in the series on it, the paper authoring tool, which is a way of writing papers where you're using the ontology all the way through. So you're being asked, you're being prompted as you go through the different parts of the paper for different input, and then at the end of it you press a button and all of the information that you've put into this sort of checklist, ontologized checklist, is then converted into written language, and you have the skeleton of a paper written. Well, what we want to do is go right back from that. Don't wait until we get to the reporting stage, right at the beginning in terms of developing the protocol. So this tool will be developed for writing protocols too. And actually Robert West, who's developed this, and myself have already used it with somebody who is designing a new study. And it's so useful because it just prompts you in a very structured way as to what needs to be specified. And then you can also hook in to ontological detail where it exists. For example, behavior change techniques. In this tool at the moment, 93 of them come down in a drop-down fashion, and you select the ones that you think of. So very good. That's really helpful. We could talk about this for hours, but I hope that's given you a flavour. Okay, the next comment or question is, sorry, it's got a funny habit of, I suppose, jumping around as different people upvote things. If we're framing research questions and method approaches to make them machine readable using the ontology, is there a risk that we then start excluding potentially useful research that is not currently expressible using the tools? Another good question. Janet, do you want to start off with that one?
So I can start off, definitely. So I think it's wrong to think that there's any research that's not expressible using the tools. It's only because an ontology gives you a collected vocabulary that is hierarchically organized. And if you don't have the exact specific detailed level that you need for your study in the ontology, you just need to then use one level hierarchically higher, right? So you need to use a broader term. I think that the ecosystem as a whole needs to adapt quickly to the pace of change in the domain so that it's got feedback loops to expand the ontologies when people do new types of research. That's given, but it will never be the case that research will be excluded because it's not currently expressible. I think that's not how it works.
Thanks, Jana. Mary, did you want to add to that, or should we go on to the next?
I would like to give an example so that the whole thing that I've become aware of and using an ontological approach is that you can add to them because they're logically structured. And if anyone listening is aware of the behavior change technique taxonomy that was published in 2013, one of the tricky things there was that if someone used a behavior change technique that was not included in our 93, there was nowhere it could go and nowhere their research could go. We've been updating this now to create an ontology where it's logical, so that if you have thought of a new behavior change technique, it should be possible to work out where it fits logically. And once you've got it fitted in logically, what Jana's suggesting is you can then go to a higher level, so that, for example, if you've thought of a new way of rewarding people and it doesn't come into all of the different rewarding systems we describe, it can still be described as a higher level as a reward and go with the other evidence that's about reward, so that the kind of flexibility of including what you're doing means that people are not excluded.
Yeah, good points. Good. Patrick, thanks for that question. And Maria Carrasco's got a question, not totally unrelated. This is terrific in terms of helping to systematize scientific knowledge. How can knowledge that is not part of the scientific literature, but is critical for public health program implementation, be integrated? A concern would be that using AI could crowd out the use of such knowledge. Well, I'll just say a couple of things first on that. First of all, it is really important to go beyond published scientific literature. Hopefully, as everything gets more open, so that it's much easier to put papers onto open access platforms, it means that there won't be such a rigid distinction between those papers that are published that maybe have taken 6 months hanging around to get reviewed before they go into a high impact journal, and something that ends up in a report, which is often called the grey literature. I think as Jana used this word research ecosystem, which I like, but as it's changing and transforming, it's so much easier and there's so much more incentives to put things out there where it can be found. So the first challenge is finding it. And actually, James Thomas, who's not with us today, he's been leading the whole sort of literature surveillance approach. And he would be best placed to answer that, but maybe Jana can come in after me. So how do you find the material? That's the first thing. Obviously, you have AI tools like ChatGPT, which finds stuff that's out there, but it's a large language model. It just finds any old stuff from any old place. So, you know, we don't know where they've drawn the information from. So I think the main thing is finding it. Once it's been found, there's nothing to stop it being represented ontologically, just as we'd represent any published scientific paper ontologically, and therefore that can then be integrated with other papers that have or reports have similarly been structured in that way. So that's my immediate thinking. Jana, can you say anything more about the surveillance and how how the non-scientific published literature might be found?
So I think I can't say so much about that aside from what's sort of called grey literature, and grey literature is preprints and technical reports or reports which are commissioned by organizations. So this extends the scientific literature, but these are available through the technical platforms that we scan and do surveillance on, or that James's team do. But I think there's also a role for pointing out sort of knowledge in another sense than documents, right? So this surveillance, it works with documents, published documents, and we can find documents if they are published in alternative places. But there's also knowledge in the form of theories and models and perspectives of people with direct experience of things that are not necessarily coming into the research literature base, even the expanded research literature base. And here I think it's important to think about the way that we have data arising from studies, but we also combine this with our theories and our qualitative evidence in a kind of a synthesized approach to finally make decisions. And this makes the problem not just a data-driven, but somehow a more complex integration problem. So not only data coming from the research, but also knowledge and theories and other types of inputs into the knowledge base.
But having said that, the project we've been working on has started off with evidence from randomized controlled trials. So that in a way, that's the easiest thing to start with to develop the system, but with a vision that it should be able to incorporate much more evidence in the long run. So that if you're looking at public health programs, typically they won't have a randomization to one group and a control group, but they will have evidence of what the outcomes are. And one of the things that Jamie Hartman-Boyce emphasized was that you're looking for what is the outcome of your program. So your program can actually be related to things that come from randomized controlled trials by looking at the outcome per se without having to have a control group. And because you've got this body of evidence, you can begin to look at whether that is looking like a better outcome than is achieved by other programs. So that it's a different kind of evidence that can be integrated. And Jana's talking about an even more grey literature kind of evidence that can be integrated.
Yeah. Good. And so we've touched on the next one a little bit, but I'll just read out this question. Can artificial intelligences, such as GPT, potentially tackle this problem of finding papers and translating the papers into a uniform language? Jan, do you want to have a go at this? Again, I think it's well, I'll start. I mean, I think GPT, no, it's a large language model, and I think Jana can explain more about what that is. But there are other programs that are AI driven that are that can find papers. So Elicit, ELICEIT, is a very useful one, but it doesn't translate it into a uniform language currently. Jana, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think this is a question that's on everybody's mind at the moment. So we've seen the massive shift in the capabilities of language models that happened over the last year. Before they were, support software which generated really obvious errors in producing text, and now they can produce text which is reasonable sounding and in some cases accurate and reasonable sounding, but the language models only produce text, and this is a really important or produce text for various different formats. That's fine, but they cannot produce the type of clear extraction of data from the evidence that we need in order to synthesize, right? So they can make some kind of summary of a paper if you feed in the paper text, and this might be fairly good, the automated summary that they could produce, but they couldn't tell you exactly which behavior change technique was applied to which participant group, or how many, how big the results were, and so on. These kind of much more detailed questions that we need to extract from the evidence base, they're not able to give this kind of exact detailed level. So I think this is what's meant by translating the papers into a uniform language, the kind of structuring of the underlying evidence that is reported in the paper in a structured form. And this we don't have this in automated form, but many of the different things that we want to do with papers can be somehow supported by AI technologies. And this we're seeing clear benefits for saving time in the future, potentially.
Yeah.
Can I suggest that have you, you might want to think about looking at one of the earlier webinars where James Thomas describes the system that's being developed within the project to find papers, and by using the ontology to express what the papers are finding into a language that can be intelligible. And for example, when you talk about uniform language, one of the things that's hard to translate, and I'm not sure that the systems you're talking about would work very well for this, is how do you get the information out of a table to express it to the user? What's the uniform language for that? And a major part of what James Thomas does is finds everything, translates it into meaningful language, and struggles to get the information out of the tables into the same uniform language. So I think is it 2 webinars ago that he was on? Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be a step forward if all reports had standardized ways of having data tables? Because at the moment, you know, how does a machine know what a column is and a row is, because it's so jumbled up and varied? So on the one hand, you know, we absolutely need syntheses of evidence. We need to see the whole body of evidence together. It's not good enough to have just a few studies here or there. But on the other hand, we need the minutiae of detail from each of those studies to synthesize with the detail of all the other studies in order to really understand what's going on. And so that this is what we're trying to do. And this is what I think a lot of the other AI tools just can't do. Well, they can't do it, otherwise we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Is another reason, this is from anonymous attendee, is another reason it's difficult to investigate heterogeneity properly, because context differs so hugely across studies and we can't standardize context, or can we? Context varies massively. You know, even if studies were done within one city, depending on which part of the city, which part of the population, was it before or after COVID-19, all sorts of things is massively variable. So no, the idea isn't to standardize context. The idea is to be able to document the richness of the variety of context in such a way that we can draw generalizations about what aspects of context are important for what kind of change. So that's my starter. Mary or Jana, did you want to add to that?
Just the same point, there's a way in which people dodge the column and don't describe context, they just describe the study. And we can often not have any of the information about context in the papers. What we would hope is that we're producing an ontology that will enable people to describe who the population are, what the setting is that is happening in. And so that we think that these tools will help people to describe what's going on, even if they don't use any of the other things that we're producing. Maybe it can help people to describe context.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just add that I think there's, in some cases, we don't even know what dimensions of context we need to formalize, because we haven't thought about even this kind of systematically enough to generate the data that would tell us what the dimensions of the context are. I mean, of course, we know about population and setting, but really, which are the parts that will drive the heterogeneity? This is a research question in a way.
Yeah. I mean, we started with population and setting, and then we realized events. Events is another very important part. And, you know, you come across words like culture, you know, these big words. These need to be broken down in terms of what do we mean by culture, so that, again, we can define it. And it means many, many different things. So some of it might be about shared beliefs. You know, that would be in our mechanism of action ontology. Some might be aspects of characteristics of populations. Some might be much more to do with actually the setting, what type of city or, you know, rural neighborhoods you live in. So I think one of the things ontologies do is to make you really interrogate words and what are we really meaning by this? Because, you know, if we took 6 people in a room and asked them all to define culture, my guess is we'd have very different definitions. Okay, great. So let's go on to Paul Ekbrom's point. A very, very interesting question. At what point does an ontology have to draw on, or at least relate to, theory? This relates particularly, but not exclusively, to the realist evaluation approach, which focuses on causal mechanisms interacting with one another and with contexts. Now, coincidentally, there was a paper written on the difference between ontologies and theories, and that paper is written by Mary, Jana, and myself, because we were trying to get our heads around, you know, what's the difference between them, what's the essence of the definitions of each of them, and maybe some clever person who's behind the scenes can find it for us. I can't even remember where we published it, and put it in the chat.
Nature Human Behaviour.
It was in Nature Human Behaviour. I think it was as a correspondence, actually, yeah, replying to somebody else. Always an interesting way of writing when it's a kind of dialogue. Who
yes.
wants? Jana.
Yeah, so I think it's really tricky because, of course, you cannot look at definitions of things without having some theoretical lens that you're looking through, right? It's not really possible to disentangle this, but I would give the one sentence summary that what we're trying to do is a little bit different. When you're building an ontology, you're trying to anchor the sort of entities that theories are about on definitions that work in a way across different perspectives. And this is it has a interoperability and enabling synthesis perspective. But when you're building a theory, you are trying to give the or one explanation of things, and this is necessarily quite tied to a specific perspective and doesn't have to enable interoperability or different ways of looking at things. So I think this comes at it from comes at the accumulation of knowledge from a different angle.
Can I comment on the way in which theories sort of are enclosed structures, whereas ontologies are more sort of relating externally as well as internally? And so in the area that I work in, there are many, many, many concepts of perceived control. In 1996, there were 100, so I don't know how many there are now. But if you use an ontological structure, it allows you to relate these different constructs. Nobody's actually done this task, but it would be potential within an ontological structure. We've done tiny bits of it, but not the huge thing. And then it would allow you to see what the links are between theories and the extent to which theories are introducing new constructs rather than isolated constructs, because there's a way in which there's a lot of pressure on people to create their own new constructs. So the kind of rewards that are involved in research encourage people to create new words for old things, but that doesn't matter if we can still relate them in the structure.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. The link to the paper has been put up in the chat, so I've just noticed there's a very interesting set of comments being put up in the chat, so do have a look at the chat as well as the Q&A.
Susan, there's a bit we've missed about that question, which is about the interacting between the mechanisms.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So causal mechanisms interacting with one another and with contexts. Jan, did you want, Jana or Mary?
Well, I would just say that in general, sort of from the position that we're at now, the really detailed findings or axioms about causal mechanisms and interactions between causal mechanisms would not be within the scope of the ontology. Only which entities there kind of were and the core relationships between entities would be in scope for the ontology. And the details of causal mechanisms interacting with each other, that would probably be within scope of specific theories, because it would be the sort of thing you'd be testing, wouldn't you, in some studies. And it wouldn't be kind of a priori definitional knowledge.
Yeah, theories or algorithms to test these things out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mary, did you want to add to that point?
No, I just felt we shouldn't miss it.
Yeah. So I think it's a general point. It's really important to know what ontologies are and what they can do, what the benefits are. But they only do what they do. They don't do more things. But what they give is a very well-structured knowledge representation that then enables computation, but as well as people to more easily handle, manage all these different entities in a logical way that then can produce more insights about questions, about interactions, which is absolutely key. The other thing that's really held us back in terms of interactions, and it's not just these interactions between behavior change techniques, and mode of delivery, between them and mechanisms of action, etc., is not having large enough quantities of data to work with. That's been one of our big things that's held us back. Hence, this is one of the other reasons for this project, to be able to harness computer science to really be able to access and deal with and analyze large amounts of data.
I think we might be out of time, Susan.
Oh, are we already? Oh my gosh. I think you're right. I'm so sorry, Belinda. And then we got another Ian too. We've got another couple of questions here. But they will go up. And at the end of it, what we're planning to do is take all the questions from the webinar series and address them and write something based on them. So your points haven't been lost, even if we haven't been able to deal with them today. So great questions. Thank you so much for them all. And any further comments and reflections, please send them in. You can either scan this code if you're quick enough now, or the slides will be sent to you, or click on the link posted in the chat box. They will all be incorporated, put onto OSF too. So everything that's coming in these discussions and your contributions will be part of what comes out of this webinar series. So what next? Next week, 5th of April, we have what are ontologies and what can they be used for? So we've touched on these, but this will be an in-depth look at it, and it'll be conversation between Mary and Jana. So do come back, bring your friends. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you and goodbye.